Hey everyone, welcome to the Diet Doc Life Mastery Podcast. I'm Joe Klemczewski, back with licensed mental health therapist and counselor Jeff Stuckey. So Jeff, you bumped up against a topic last time we chatted a few weeks ago, and I just wanted to dive in deeper because you kind of rattled something in me. I've been filtering conversations a little bit differently just because of some of the things you said. But I want to give somebody listening here who may not know you a little backstory on you, if you don't mind, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to
All right. So the first time I ever saw you, we had not yet met, but I listened to you giving a lecture, and I was captivated. And I thought, man, this guy may be the best public speaker I have ever heard. And it was all in your temperament. It was all in your tone. You were so incredibly measured and thoughtful in your communication process. And I thought, this guy's just a master. He's using these dramatic pauses. He's completely manipulating the audience exactly where he wants them to go, which still may be true. But later, as I got to know you personally, I thought this guy is just somebody who takes communication seriously enough. At least he has a learned discipline, which I want to talk about, to just not think before you speak. You're at least trying to take out some of the I don't know, some of the pitfalls of communicating. You're measuring your words carefully, and I want to know if I'm correct in that assessment, and then I want to talk about that process.
Mostly, it was kind of an interesting journey. It kind of picked me more than I picked it. Early on, when I was in high school, I was a jock and got recruited to do plays and be on the speech team. Very low social value, man. That's not. So that was kind of like my dirty little secret in high school, and had a significant amount of success in public speaking. I was in humorous interpretation, interestingly enough, and just kind of had a knack for it. So then, just kind of in my personal evolution, I'm a strong extrovert, and so public speaking is much more natural for me. In fact, doing therapy, which is more of an introverted function, really comes at a high cost to me. It is, although I love it, very passionate about it, it's depleting. So one, just kind of having a natural ability for it. But I think the other piece of it was the skills that I was learning in therapy and in working with clients had an incredible amount of transfer over to my public speaking, which again was more of a subconscious than conscious process, but was honing that skill in ways that I wasn't even aware of.
Well, I know when I have spoken to you personally, there's always kind of a professional overlay. I mean, when I'm sitting down talking to somebody, we can't go 2 sentences without somebody talking about nutrition or fitness. And I'm sure with you, it's the same thing. People want to get your views on some things with therapeutic value. And you mentioned last time that in your own therapy work, you're constantly filtering between content and process. And one of the things you told me years and years ago is if the process is not functioning properly, if the mechanics of it are not working, it doesn't matter what content you put in there. And so a lot of times people will come to you with issues thinking, okay, please help me solve this one thing. And you pull them out of that and you say, look, your whole method of interpretation and seeing this and processing through it is just not going to work, no matter how much you focus on that one thing. And backing up into just how we communicate, when somebody would bring that to you, if you have to discuss that as a talking point about just saying, let's talk about your process of communication, how do you look at that? How do you break it apart as a therapist and help another human being understand it?
As that distinction, the distinction between content and process, where I kind of started to hone that distinction was doing marriage therapy. And people don't come to marriage therapy. They don't come to marriage therapy to improve their marriage. I don't give a fuck about improving their marriage. They just want to know who's right and who's wrong. And so as a therapist, I found myself always being triangulated between, one side or the other. And, and I'm more of a directive, assertive kind of guy. And so I, it's been so long ago, I couldn't even tell you where that distinction came from between content and process. But in my work and still a significant amount of the work that I do is relationship therapy, I make that distinction from the beginning. When I do my intake, that is part of it. Like, I don't give two shits about what you're fighting about, because that's completely irrelevant. That's a content piece. And when the process of communication is broken, that's when we start to just become desperate about getting more content to stuff into the broken process. So we become historical, anything and everything is fair game. We just continue to escalate. So I make that distinction in the beginning that I do marriage therapy. Okay, I'm not a referee. I don't give a shit who's right or who's wrong, because that's a zero-sum game, one winner, one loser. That's the destruction of your relationship. We are going to focus on the process, and I'm going to teach you how to do that. And so in that, my marriage therapy, it's a pretty rigorous process in the beginning of, exercises that I make them work on, a certain communication style that they have to master before we move forward into anything else. And then I started to find that distinction to be incredibly helpful in every relationship. So when I do consulting, I make that distinction, content, process, whatever it is, because it's the basic rule of a relationship. If the process is not a healthy, constructive process that promotes intimacy and trust and connection and respect, it doesn't matter what content you put in it. And in fact, the more content that you put into it, the more self-harm is going to come as a result of that, and the more polarized the relationship's going to become.
And as you started teaching me some of these things, I started reflecting on that in every form of communication I have with clients, with staff, with children, with just anybody. And I realized very quickly that part of that temperate tone is truly because there has to be some thought and interpretation in communication versus just reactive, kind of verbal volleys. And so what I started doing is I think I even recommended this book to you, the John Gottman book, Making Love Last. And even though there's probably a handful of really good heuristics, he broke it down, the four horsemen of the marital apocalypse being, these four types of communicative processes, and two are kind of active and two are kind of passive. But he describes marriage communication breakdown as you can either have contempt or criticism toward your partner, or maybe you get defensive, or perhaps you stonewall. And I've used that grid as I see conflict in people, even in social media, what we talked about last time. And instantly you see if somebody is really attacking and they're just cutting and they want to score a punch, they've got some kind of criticism or contempt for that person. Then you've got people who just instantly get defensive. And I've noticed a lot of that in people. And then you could have somebody like me who's a bit of a stonewaller, and I'm just saying, okay, I'm done. I'll just walk away. I'll shell up and leave. So, is that something that you kind of use, or what are the best methods of just understanding communication that you give people?
Well, yes, those are very valuable. Now, and you're probably aware of this, he's reduced it down even smaller to, in communication, we either turn towards the other or away from the other. And I find that distinction to be incredibly helpful. And what I do with my clients, I just do a silly little example. Again, I make the distinction between content and process. And I will say to them that, okay, so you come into my office, and you're thinking, oh, Jeff, he's wonderful. He's really going to help me. And then I confront you with some shit that you don't like. And suddenly I'm a fucking idiot, which always happens. And so you come into my office and you say to me, Jeff, you're a fucking idiot. And nothing that you suggested helped. In fact, it just made it worse. Okay. So my commitment is to the relationship. And what would happen early on as a therapist when I was completely and totally insecure because I had no idea what I was doing, that would just simply activate my flight response. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make things worse. How can I make things better? And so I would just become very reactive and passive in the therapeutic process, not recognizing that their reaction was a result of their discomfort. The other response would be the fight response, which would be, well, if I suck so bad, get the hell out of my office. Neither one of those are useful because the relationship starts to decline. And so one of the things that I would have to practice is, and this was where Carl Rogers' approach, unconditional positive regard, always being for my client. It's not about whether I like them or dislike them. It's being for them. And I found that again to be stepping away from my evangelical Christian orientation. We're right, you're wrong, we have to prove, like that was never useful for me. But always being for people, that was really something that I could resonate with. And that was really a distinction in my change as a therapist, but even my approach to life. And so one of the things that so in that, it's like, okay, Jeff, you suck as a therapist. So rather than getting into that primal brain, flight response, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, or fight response, get the hell out of my office, what I do is really try to stay into the prefrontal cortex, the rational brain. You have the right to feel that way, and I am for you. So my response then would be, what I heard you say is that you think that I suck as a therapist. Is that what you want me to hear? Now, I'm not agreeing with you. I think I'm a badass therapist, but I'm giving you the right to feel that way. But I want to create understanding in the relationship. And so that's the first thing that I teach couples to do is if I'm reacting to something that you say, if it's activating my fight or flight response, then that's an insecurity in me that I need to deal with. And that was a point of recognition for me as a therapist is, whoa, I am still really insecure. I don't have much trust in my ability as a therapist. So I've got to do that work. That sucks, man. That is not an exciting thing to admit that, wow, I'm a freaking insecure person and I'm supposed to be the expert and I have a hell of a lot of work to do. But there's incredible freedom in that. I am now anchored, as we often refer to the difference between internal and external locus of control. You control how I feel about me, which is so volatile. I control how I feel about me. And so now that I've recognized that this reaction, I have some control over that. If I'm willing to do the work inside of me, anything you say doesn't threaten me. And you have the right to think and feel that way. And now I can just be interested and I can just want to understand.
And that brings me back to that thoughtful pause, because this obviously took some thinking on your part to get to that point, and probably some new information you learned. And I would say, I can't remember who said this. It was maybe Nietzsche or William James or who knows, Rumi. But in the pause, in that moment where you kind of extricate yourself from the reaction, is your opportunity to grow or to divert the situation. And so as a social psychology, social science student and writer, I've spent a few years crafting that skill myself. And it's a total game changer for anybody involved in that communication. So, years and years ago, I may just react like anybody else on social media. Somebody put something political or something, and I just want to wade into the fight and see if I can, just screw some people up, change their minds, whatever. And now I will intentionally lay out some ground rules for communication. I did this yesterday in a post, and I said, hey guys, this is going to be a fun game. Let's talk about politics on social media. And I brought up something that I think is very important for us to all be discussing right now, because everybody is completely polarized and fighting about their responses to the pandemic and the shutdown and all that. And I laid out the ground rules. I said, now let's see how civil we can be. Let's see who can support each other in this. And you can see every single person who I've seen on their own pages or in other threads be incredibly reactive, violent, angry, just vile people. I've seen them just come in and ask some questions. It's what you said last time in our discussion, which is to be curious instead of angry. And it really sets a tone for people to think, well, gosh, I guess I can listen to somebody else's perspective, don't have to agree with it, but I also don't have to fight against it or feel threatened by it. And I just wonder, as you see people in our culture struggle with that, and you might see somebody that you just kind of take an interest in, you don't want to see them struggle with that. How do you kind of bring people forward into learning to communicate better for their own good?
Well, and doing exactly that, and it's actually Frankl who said, between
Yes.
stimulus and response,
Yes.
there is a space, and it is in that space where change occurs. That's been one of my favorite quotes of all times as well. And it's like, that is really true. It is a microscopic space, but when you find that space and you start to widen it, there's a profound freedom there. But I love being curious. And I think part of it is that I've seen the power in it. That when I can be curious about another person, and I've seen this it over and over again, transform marriages that were just, I mean, on the brink, if not beyond, to where curiosity and being interested in another person. Now, it doesn't always go well. Sometimes when I'm curious with people, they're like, well, what the fuck do you care? And it's like, and it can be a little bit threatening. And I also recognize that curiosity can be, especially in our society today. And when I know for me, one, that it is a skill that I have to keep honed. I probably 2/3 of the people that I read and follow are people that, and that may not be exact right ratio, I staunchly disagree with. I, in fact, mostly am offended by the way that they look at the world. But I want to keep that space broadened. And when I hear something now that is unusual to me, or a perspective that I've never seen before, or even offensive to me, I force myself to wade into that space and just be curious, with a realistic expectation that my curiosity may be accepted or rejected. I don't know. If it's rejected, that's fine, because again, I have that internal locus of control. But the majority of the time, that's all people want, is just to simply be heard. They're not even thinking about, when I work with my couples, the basic script that I give them is that when one shares, the other says, this is what I heard you say, and then they'll repeat back as close to verbatim as possible. And then they'll say, is that what you want me to hear? Now, the reason that I make them say that is that puts it in the subjective. This is what I heard. I don't know if that's what you said. I'm over here freaking out, trying not to react to you and scream at you. So in the midst of that emotional tension, this is what I heard. Is that what you wanted me to hear? Now, if I were to say, this is what you said, now I've created a power struggle. No, it's not. I didn't say that, you asshole. That's what's wrong in our relationship. You never listened to me. So if I keep it in the subjective, one is, this is what I heard. You really can't argue that point, right? So that avoids the power struggle. And then when I turn back and say, Joe, is that what you wanted me to hear? Then I can stay out of my fight or flight response, because I'm focusing on every word that you're saying, which is simply a form of anchoring and meditation. rather than feeling and reacting to what Joe is saying, I'm going to give every word that he says the dignity and respect of trying to hear it. And it is amazing to me, most of the time when couples master that dialogue, this is what I heard you say, is that what you wanted me to hear? And it's simply, yes, it is, or no, it's not. It's the process piece. And when we fix the process piece, then you can start putting meaningful, deep, rich content into that process. And that's when relationships really start to come alive, and we cooperate, and we're allies, and we're supportive, and we want to protect each other, and we want to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And when we do that, I mean, that is when life has profound meaning. And curiosity is so, I mean, it just, I can't emphasize enough what a powerful, powerful skill that is for one human being to have, because it in and of itself can transform a relationship.
I would agree. And everything that you said, I think, is probably learned primarily in those crisis moments in a relationship. But as I've learned this from you, to take that into more broadened social relationships has done exactly what you said. It gives you power to allow relationships to flourish. And you're exactly right. When you are truly for that person, and what really gets me kind of excited to connect a couple dots with in terms of what you're saying, you are creating that space. You are widening that space that you're describing when you press pause and ask them, hey, is this what you said? Am I hearing this correctly? Because it gives them a chance to rethink as well. That was a little harsh. Let me back up a little bit. And there's a lot of de-escalation that happens in that. And the interesting thing is, another, Gottmanism is, he talks about being emotionally flooded. As soon as you reach a level 10 emotionally, you are absolutely getting no neuronal feedback to your neocortex. It's all in the limbic system. And he said in those moments as a couple, you need to recognize it, call a timeout, go to different corners of your house and like set a timer for 30 minutes. You're just done until people calm down. But I'm not sure if you would really need that if you could master the skill you're describing, because it really pulls you back into your neocortex. And as writers, we learn this. The creative process is happening subconsciously. It's happening with a lot of interplay of emotion. And when you start editing your creative process, you immediately flip into the neocortex. And that's not necessarily what you want to do. You want to be creative here and then later come back and edit, because they are two distinct functions and even locations in your brain. And what you're describing is intentionally coming back into that diffused editing mode, out of the emotion, to say, wait a second, let's think about this a little bit more closely. And I think that's just an amazing understanding of those biological processes happening in our brains.
Yeah, and it really is. And this is, and unfortunately, in the times that we find ourselves, sometimes we are very, very skeptical of simple. And I think we artificially think that simple and easy are synonymous, and they have nothing in common. And these simple processes, I mean, it's, the greatest engineer can reduce a mechanism down to its fewest number of necessary parts. And that is I've always thought that to be a very useful metaphor for communication. I mean, it is, we need to reduce communication down to its fewest number of necessary parts. And that skill, simple. That thing ain't easy, especially when you're saying something that makes me uncomfortable. And I want to say, fuck this understanding shit. That's stupid. And you need to know how stupid it is. I mean, staying present and staying for you is an incredibly difficult thing to do, but a profoundly transformational thing to do for both of us.
Do you agree with me that the center of this whole operational piece we're describing is either coming from a place of insecurity or security if you master it? And I had a good example of this. I was just, flipping through social media this morning, and I saw somebody post something again about the pandemic. And their words were, "You can't let the government control you." And then somebody echoed back, "Yeah, you can't let the government control you." And in these relationships that you're describing, because what the government's telling you to do is probably good for you. It's probably going to save your life. It's probably going to save you money if we can get through this pandemic, more quickly. But they were so threatened, thinking somebody was going to subvert their autonomy. And so they had no choice in their mind but to lash out and protect their own personal authority. Don't you think even in one-on-one conversations that's the biggest barrier, that we just can't let that go? We can't just give ourselves in vulnerability to that other person and be for them. We have to self-protect instead.
Yes, and yes, and I was listening to his name's Paul Conti. He's a psychiatrist. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's fascinating, a brilliant individual. And he was speaking to that point in a podcast that I was listening to recently. And he was observing that we have gotten to a point socially and personally to feel like we have to be afraid enough. Like we can't be afraid enough to be safe. Like some switch has flipped to where it's like, no, I have to be completely fucking terrified if I'm going to keep myself safe, which then creates almost this self-sustaining system where it's like, no, I have to feed my fear. I have to feed my fear. And I'm terrified. I don't know how you get that genie back in the bottle. That is, and then to see it on a macro level. And it's almost like compromise is a dirty word, or wanting to understand your perspective versus sparring with you, no matter how personal it gets, is some kind of acknowledgement of weakness. Or it's like the whole thing is flipped upside down. And I wish I could tell you how to flip the thing back over.
Well, that's
one conversation at a time, I think, is as futile as that seems. It seems like every conversation now is exponentially more critical. There is no margin of error. I have to be so profoundly responsible in every interaction that I have if we're going to have any hope at all.
Well, there's definitely a lack of, or a fear of loss of control and authority. So when you see, kind of like what I talked about last time, when 7.5 billion people are all of a sudden communicating on a dime with each other through social media, a lot of people are seeing their power go away. I mean, white people are a minority in the United States now. For the first time ever, Christianity is a minority in the United States now. I mean, Europe has been ahead of us for decades, but a lot of people are struggling with this loss of power. You look at conservatism and the fact that, the average Fox News viewer, for example, is 65 years old. And when the baby boomers die, there's going to be this massive political shift. And you see these losses of power moving people toward that center of fear out of just pure desperation. And I think, regardless of what we're talking about, religion, politics, personal conflict, marriage, it always does come down to that individual in the moment, in that conversation response of, am I secure enough to open that space, think about this, not instantly be threatened on all sides, but just let this conversation play out. And like you said, it does take one conversation at a time. But I will leave you with this in terms of a thought I've been ruminating on for 10 years. I started a writing project 10 years ago. I have thousands of pages of notes and articles and so forth that I will eventually compile into this book. The working title that I've had for 10 years, I've now recently changed, but the working title was, and I even bought the URL, The Economy of Fear, because fear drives us like no other emotion. You can, no matter what emotion you're experiencing, you put enough fear in and you can completely flip the switch in another direction. And I really do think when you look at the biggest institutions that rival for our attention and to manipulate our behavior, it's always with fear. That is, I mean, we know that intuitively. That's the way you get somebody to do what you want them to do. And my premise to you is that in these interpersonal relationships, whether it's marital, relational, or just friends and social, you gotta back away from that sense of threat and fear and do exactly what you said, Jeff. Say, in that moment, I don't have to worry about myself. I'm just gonna be for you. I think that is the absolute key thing we all need.
And I will tell you that that has been an anchor that has served me profoundly well. It just, it, it, it gave me a sense, and this is something I think that you and I had in common that I don't know if it were palatable for either one of us, but coming out of that evangelical, staunch religious orientation where it's just imperative based, there is a right, there is a wrong, and every interaction is a zero-sum winner-loser game. It doesn't take long in that kind of an economy to see that it's bankrupt. And to know that I can always be for you. And I'm a hedonist, man. That just fucking feels good. That feels way better than wanting to be right. It's just like, dude, I don't know what you're so uptight about. I just really want to understand, man. Like, you can lower your tone if you want to or not. And there is a profound power in that I have seen transform my own life and transform the lives of countless number of clients that I am eternally grateful for.
Well, it pervades every single activity or career we could ever involve ourselves in. Even in the science community, when I see all of my friends who are, either researchers or consuming and interpreting research, there are basically two camps. There are the people who have a position that they will defend no matter what. Everything is filtered through that grid. And then you see other people who always take an attitude of, yeah, well, maybe, let's look at the methodology. And I understand in that one particular study that they think they see this, and let's compare it to all these other things. And yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I can learn from that. But they just don't get so fired up and threatened over every single little piece of data that comes out. They take that holistic perspective, put it in a chronological context, and realize that we're so wrong so much of the time. Why would I fight and defend anything? I mean, anything that I think is completely empirically correct now, I may have a different opinion a year from now. So why would I die on that hill? I would much rather be the person who's like, yeah, let's see. I mean, let's talk about it. We'll pick it apart and then we'll go have a beer.
Yeah, and I know my capacity for being wrong, and it is extraordinary. I mean, it is just, it's like, I'm probably wrong is kind of my baseline assumption. And that takes a lot of fucking pressure off, dude. It's like, nah, I probably am. Let's talk about it. And it makes things much, much easier than trying to constantly convince myself that I'm right about something.
All right, man. Well, as I started this podcast with just understanding your methodology for your own thought process and communication, from workshops and stage and public speaking, which I'm still enamored by you and study you, to how you do it with therapy type clients in your own personal life. I just think you're a master at communication. So it's going to be tough to figure out some better topics to cover in the future. But you are always a welcome guest here, and I hope to have you on regularly.
Would always love to do it. It's always incredibly beneficial for me. I always learn a lot from it. So I'm always available.
Okay, Jeff Stuckey, thank you very much. And we'll see you guys next time in the Life Mastery Podcast.